or a dense neural network. So those three are kind of synonymous, but they generally kind of mean that all of your inputs are connected to all of your nodes in the hidden layer, which are all connected to your output layer. So that's what dense means, they're all connected. So I'll pause for a second and see if there's any questions on this diagram. We'll kind of revisit some of these terms that I've thrown out as we actually jump into the code and in Colab. But I wanted to kind of set the stage with a review of the general architecture.
So what exactly does each H represent again? You said electron or neuron?
Neuron, yeah. So all the circles represent neurons, and the H stands for hidden layer, so hidden neuron.
Okay. So what does a neuron represent in terms of like the actual code that will be? Are we going to go into that?
Yeah, so we'll jump into that in a little bit more detail, but ultimately the way that your network learns is you can think of every line in this chart as a matrix multiplication. So the way that your network is initialized is all of these lines represent a number that's randomly initialized, right? So in this case, if you counted all the lines, I welcome you to do it, but it's, 3, 3, 3 is 9, plus 3, 12, 13. So you have 13 numbers that get initialized to some value. And if you imagine a supervised, let's say, classification problem, what you're essentially doing is you're assigning these 13 random numbers, usually between 0 and 1, depending on what initializer you're using. What you end up doing is you have some input, let's say x0 took a value of 5, x1 took a value of 7. You pass that through your network by doing this matrix multiplication. So you take that input, multiply it by the weight, and then once it goes to this hidden neuron, it gets transformed. So we'll learn about some of the different activation functions, but essentially it gets transformed in some way that's supposed to help model some of the nonlinearities in the input. And then from here, it gets multiplied by another weight because you're going through another line. And then essentially at the output, they all get like summed and combined into one prediction. So it's a weird process, but what ends up happening is you get some prediction. Initially, it's random, so you can assume your predictions initially are going to be really bad. And what you do at this output is you have the true value. So let's say the true value for our binary classification, the first sample, the true value is 1. And we predict 0.2, which rounds down to 0. What we end up doing is we take the error and then we try to update the weights so that they get closer to a set of weights that would predict 1 for that sample.
Bruno?
Yes.
I'm sorry. How do you know the error? Are you describing the process of training where you know the answer?
Yeah, so you know the error because you're passing in like model.fit and you have your X and your Ys. So you have your inputs, you have your expected outputs, and you're multiplying your inputs by a bunch of weights, getting some predicted output, and then taking the difference between your prediction and the actual. And we'll talk more, like in the next module, we'll talk more about the process I just described as roughly kind of gradient descent and backpropagation. We'll talk more about that in detail. But ultimately, the parameters that are learned in your neural network are these weights, which you can think of every line in this architecture diagram as a single weight. And you're trying to find the optimal weight that when multiplied by all of your inputs optimizes for some metric. Could be accuracy, could be mean squared error, depending on your use case.
Good evening, Bruno. Can
yes.
I ask you a little bit about the bias? Can you explain? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the bias, I anticipated when I showed this diagram, I would get that question. So there's a really nice Stack Overflow post that demonstrates what the bias can do. I'll pull that in here. So imagine, this is a very, very simple example, but imagine you have one input, one weight, and then you have one output. This is kind of the simple kind of mathematical representation of what a neural network does. So it takes your input X, multiplies it by a weight, in this case W0, and then transforms it. In this case, the activation function is called the sigmoid function, which if you remember logistic regression in Unit 2, it's very, very similar to the logistic curve. And it looks like this. So what this is doing, the sigmoid function broadly kind of represents, the simplest way to describe it is it's a squishification function, right? So there's only two values that your sigmoid could output. It's 0 or 1. And you could always round, to the nearest 0 or 1. So it's useful for binary classification tasks like this. And you'll see that these different lines represent different weight values. So the red line is a weight of 0.5, green of a weight of 1, blue a weight of 2. And your model, as you pass more training data in, it's trying to learn the optimal weight that maps like the inputs to outputs. And you can see that by changing the weight, you essentially change the steepness of this curve. But let's imagine one of your inputs is 5, and you want to output 0 for an input of 5. So let's say, let's say that was age, and your model was trying to predict, based on the age, can the rider ride this ride, right, at a carnival or something like that. If they were 5 and you wanted to say, hey, you have to be 5 or older, and you wanted to like develop a model or a neural network to map that input to output, you would want to predict 0 when the input is 5. But no matter what you do with the weights, if the input is 5 and you go to any of these lines, you're always going to predict 1. So changing the weights doesn't allow you that flexibility of being able to map your inputs across different ranges to specific values. So in this case, when you add a bias to this very simple network, you're still taking your input X times weight 0, but then you're adding your bias times weight 1, and that is what gets passed into the sigmoid function. So it's the sum of the like multiplication or the dot products essentially. So what this allows you to do is when you change, so for the same weight, so imagine the weight was always 1, but when you change the bias, you can shift this curve left to right. So in this case, if you wanted to predict 1 when, or if you wanted to predict 0 when the input is 5, you could shift the bias by 10, let's say, to the right, and that would enable you to predict, in this case, correctly. And when I looked at this diagram, like all of these weights, including the biases, are learned parameters. So the biases essentially enable your model to more flexibly predict the output and shift the activation function left or right.
And the activation function is supposed to be linear?
So actually, the activation functions are supposed to be nonlinear, and
Nonlinear.
I know, yeah. So this is one of the benefits of neural networks, as a differentiator, is that the activation functions are nonlinear, and in a little bit we'll kind of look at, like, I have an image of the different activation functions, and we'll dive into this. But I think we'll look at some code, we'll put together some networks, we'll talk through some of the different components, and then we'll come back to this. And I think it'll have, with more context, I think it'll be useful to review that a little bit later today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So these are all great questions. I appreciate all of them coming in. I encourage you, like, if you're interested about these questions, the 3 blue 1 brown will help answer some of these with really nice visuals. But in terms of the general kind of architecture, we take some inputs, multiply them by weights, transform them in these hidden neurons, multiply the output of that by another weight, and get to an output. And that's essentially called a forward propagation, right? You're taking some inputs, passing them through your network to get a prediction. How your predictions get good is you do this over and over again, and you iteratively improve the weights until they get closer and closer to predicting the values that you want. And that's the process called backpropagation, and we'll dive into, like, next lecture. One of the objectives is really understanding how backpropagation works. So we'll jump into that in more detail next lecture, but generally you can think of this as two processes: forward propagation to get to a prediction, back propagation kind of assigns blame in a sense to certain weights, updates certain weights more than others, and then does that again for each successive layer. And when your model converges after training it for some time, you're left with weights that are optimized, that when you multiply a new input by those weights and do the transformations, you get some end product that's a good prediction. And we'll dive into, like, we'll see a lot of this throughout the next 2 weeks. So if that was information overload, I apologize, but we'll jump in and actually play around with the play around with the Keras API a little bit.
Bruno, just like really quick follow-up question. What is the activation function in that diagram of the neurons? Is it in the Hindenburg layer or?
So you specify the activation function at the layer level. So if you had many layers, you could have different activation functions in different layers if you wanted to. But it's essentially like each neuron gets transformed by the activation function. So sigmoid is a common one. In this example, they were using the sigmoid activation function. And you can think of this this computation right here. So like weight 0 times input plus weight 1 times bias. That would happen in each hidden neuron. So in this chart, you would have a computation like that for each one. And in this case, it would be, right, so like this one would be x0 times weight 0, x1 plus x1 times weight 1, let's say, the sigmoid of all of that plus the bias term. And each one of these would be like summing the dot product of 3 inputs, the 2 inputs and the bias, times a weight, and then taking the sigmoid of that. All right, so let's jump back into our notebook here. So I think we just went through most of these descriptions. So we understand roughly what weights and biases are. We know the role that a neuron plays, and in the Canvas objective one, it kind of talks a little bit about how neurons in neural networks are intended to kind of model like biological neurons, in that, you know, when you have a thought and, you know, these neurons need to kind of communicate to each other. Like if I, you know, wanted to grab my water bottle, there's neurons firing that are kind of coming from my brain to tell my body to move my arm in a certain direction, right? And that's a chain reaction. So that's the layered effect of like all these neurons are connected to each other. But the neuron you can kind of think of as a gatekeeper, right? So the activation function is deciding like what signal to let through and what signal to not let through, which in sigmoid you can kind of see as the 0 or 1, like let some of this signal in and let some of this signal get blocked out, to eventually result in something that you know, a particular action that you want to take. And then activation functions, we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but the goal of an activation function is essentially to be a nonlinear a nonlinear differentiable function that you can use to transform your inputs, and then they're kind of critical in some of the calculus that goes on behind the scenes of calculating the derivative and understanding how much to update the weights after kind of doing the forward propagation of your inputs. And then layers, we talked about those as well. And then the last piece is the loss function, and we'll talk a little bit about different loss functions, but essentially the loss function is what you're trying to optimize for. So we'll look at in a few minutes kind of this first example, and we'll look at what the loss function is there. But for this first sample data set, we have 2 inputs and a y variable we're trying to predict. This kind of represents an OR gate if you're familiar with like electronics. But you essentially have x1 and x2, and essentially if either x1 or x2 is high, so 1, the y is 1, or I guess vice versa. Yeah. Well, so it's almost. I think it's actually miscoded. I think. Sorry, I'm going to change that last value to 0 or to 1, and the first value to 0. This would be an OR gate. So that one was actually just a misclassified. Like, I don't know if that was a different gate that is more difficult to predict, but this would represent like 0, 0 is going to return 0. And then if x1 or x2 takes on a value of 1, then your output is 1, right? So you can kind of think of this as like, imagine you had 2 pins on a circuit card, and if either one is connected, the light turns on. And the Keras TensorFlow API will kind of walk through a few different ways to specify neural networks, but in this case, we'll use the sequential API, which is the most popular. And it's essentially you instantiate this class object, so model, and then you can add layers to it via the model.add command. And there's different layer types that you can, you'll kind of learn through just using different architectures. But if we go to TensorFlow Keras layers, the docs are really good. Within layers, there's a bunch of different ones, and this is some of the learning curve that is difficult to work with. But I promise there's like 60 different layer types. You're only going to use like 7 or 8 of them, and there's common design patterns for how you'll use them. So by the end of the sprint, you'll be really comfortable with the dense layer types and some of the other layers that help reduce overfitting. And then in the next sprint, we'll talk about all of the other layer types that you'll encounter when you're building specific architectures. But as I mentioned, in this case, there's a few different inputs. So this first one is the number of units. So what we're saying is we want to have one output unit, an input dimension of 2. So we have 2 columns, x1 and x2, and we're using x as our input. So we're essentially, like, if you look at x, it's an array with 2 values. So our input dimension is 2. Our activation function is the sigmoid. So we're going to use that sigmoid kind of curve that I showed before as our activation function, like this. And then so that's the first step. And if you wanted to add more layers to this model, you could always do like model.add another dense layer, which just means fully connected with some parameters. The important thing is your output. So when you create this first layer, we're saying we have 2 inputs and we have 1 output. And when you add another layer, model.add dense layer, it will infer what the what the output of the previous layer is, and it'll allow you to specify a different output for each layer. So, looking at this diagram, we're saying we have 2 inputs and 1 output, so ignore this hidden layer. So we don't have a hidden layer right now in our network, but if we wanted to add a hidden layer, we would just add another model.add and then a dense layer. And in that step, we would specify we want 3 neurons in the hidden layer, and you don't have to specify the input because it's able to detect what the input is based on the sequence that you've added the layers in the model.add. So the sequential API is pretty smart in that it'll throw errors if you're doing things that aren't intuitive. But this essentially, and I'm going to actually like move this into the next cell. But this would define your model. And then if you do model.summary, it'll summarize the architecture of your network here. So you can see that there's 3 parameters. We have the 2 input dimensions plus a bias. And then that's it. So we don't have any other, like we just have 3 weights that we're going to try to multiply our inputs by to get to our y values.
And where's the bias specified?
So by default, it'll add the bias. Yeah, so sometimes you can put it in your input, but by default it's going to add the bias. So we have our 2 input dimensions plus the bias that gets added, which totals 3 parameters. So what we're trying to do is when we call model.fit, we're trying to find what are the values of these 3 parameters that will enable us to map the inputs x to our outputs y. And then this intermediate step, so before you actually fit the model, this intermediate step, model.compile, this is important. And this is some of the stuff that will be difficult initially, right? So in our case, we know that we have a 0 or 1 target. So we want to predict a binary classification problem. And for that, we'll use binary cross entropy. There's a bunch of different loss functions, and you can define your own loss functions in some cases. But this is critical. Like if I change the loss function to something else, I'll either get nonsensical output or an error. So if you're doing binary classification, you use binary cross entropy. If you're curious what that loss function looks like, and we'll use it a little bit later as well, but this is what the loss function looks like. And it might look a little bit confusing at first glance, but I'll try to kind of explain how it works. So you have some weights that you multiply by your input, and you have to assess how good is this fit, right? So if you initialize your weights randomly and you're predicting wrong, let's look at the case where we want to predict 0. So look at the black curve, this y equals 0. If you want to predict 0, what your model is going to output, because we're using this like sigmoid transformation, it's going to output some number between 0 and 1. And based on our inputs, that number, let's say that number is 0.8. It'll say 0.8, how close is that to 1? And it'll measure the loss. So if we output 0.8 and we want to predict 0, what this loss value is going to be, if you go to 0.8 and you look across, the loss is 1 point something. But what you'll see is as you predict higher, as you predict closer and closer to 1, the loss goes to infinity. What you're trying to do is minimize the loss. So if you predicted 0.8, you want to adjust your weights so that the next time you see a sample like that again, you'll predict closer to 0. So the loss function, if you took the derivative of this, it's essentially like which way is downhill. And if you wanted to predict y equals 0 and you predicted 0, your loss is 0. That's perfect. So a loss of 0 is kind of like perfect accuracy. And if you predicted 1 and the actual value is 0, your loss is infinite. So this is like the worst possible scenario where your model thinks it's highly confident, let's say, that the answer is 1 when the true answer is 0. So the loss would be like 10 million or some huge value. And binary cross entropy is really useful. And essentially, you can think of these 2 curves as the way that loss gets measured. And when we actually fit this, we'll see that it'll spit out the loss and the accuracy over time. And we'll also see that right now the accuracy isn't great. So the weights didn't converge to an answer that was better than random in this case. And that's okay. So, we'll like the OR gate, there's a couple of configuration things that can make this network learn more easily. And that can be a challenge for you if you want to kind of go and try to get to a place where you can learn the OR gate with 100% accuracy. But what I really wanted to do with this section is just introduce the format of the sequential API, right? So TensorFlow, you instantiate your sequential model, and then you can add layers. The inputs, the first layer should always be dictated by your inputs. The output, the number of units that you're outputting should be specific to your problem. So in this case, we're outputting 1 number, it's 0 or 1. And so that's why it's 1 unit. And then because it's binary classification, we're going to use binary cross entropy. You can spit out other metrics if you wanted to. And then the optimizer, in this case, we're using Atom. The optimizer is something else that we'll talk in more depth about in the next class. But the optimizer, Atom, stands for like adaptive something momentum. I forget the full abbreviation. I think I have it maybe in this paper, but well, I'll show this in a few minutes. But the atom optimizer is essentially the each time you train for one epoch, it's the mechanism that helps with the backpropagation to update the weights. And I don't know if I've specified epochs, or you may see folks reference it as epochs. Each epoch or epoch is one example where you see all of your training samples, right? So we have 4 rows of data, and each epoch we're showing the model all 4 samples. We're updating the weights, and then we're starting over and we're showing it again, and we're updating the weights, starting over, showing it again, updating the weights. And in this case, we did that 5 times. And you see the loss keeps going down. If you were to train this for longer, you should see the loss kind of keep improving. And we'll dive into some of those details in more further, where we kind of look at monitoring this loss curve, understanding how the metrics are improving over time, and determining how long you need to train and whether or not you've trained long enough. After you have a fit model, you can use model.evaluate if you want to just spit out the accuracy, or you can do model.predict if you want to predict on a single sample. So those are all things that you can do, similar to scikit-learn's API, where you kind of fit, predict, score, or in this case, evaluate. All of those are very simple. But this architecture is called a perceptron. It's the very first neural network, kind of dating back to the 60s. At the time, they didn't use a sigmoid activation. They used like a step function that was essentially 0 or 1. But this was a quick overview. We'll dive into another example in more detail. We'll go through MNIST actually, which is 60,000 handwritten digits. It's image data, and we're going to try to train a multi-layer network to predict what number is in the image. And then we'll evaluate on like 10,000 holdout test data samples. And we'll review the API even further. We'll kind of go into an alternative way to specify the model. But we'll do that kind of after our break. So I think we're at a good time. We've been going at it a little while. We'll take a 5-minute break. If you have questions in the break, feel free to ask them in Slido or Slack, and I'll answer them kind of when we come back from the break. And in this next section, we'll dive into training a model with a bigger, kind of more interesting data set. All right, so let's do a 5-minute timer.
Bruno,
Hey, what's up?
did you see what I posted in Slack where it wouldn't let me change the notebook settings?
Did you like copy to Drive?
Oh,
I also
no.
I don't think I'm using the like I think I'm just using the Python runtime, not like the specific environment one. But
Okay, so just use the Python 3 and it should run through okay?
yeah, you should be able to use either one.
Does
Okay.
Colab come with TensorFlow installed?
It does, yeah.
Wasn't sure.
Yeah, no, it does have TensorFlow by default.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's a Google product. I couldn't imagine them shipping it without TensorFlow installed. All right. All right, so I see a couple of questions here. Let's take a look. So what library can be used to design those neuron graphs? I think the one, so I didn't make this chart, but I think the one that was used is called draw.io. I know folks on my team have used draw.io for various types of flowcharts, but you can essentially like color them if you want to do that, and you can draw arrows from one neuron to another and stuff. So you can draw architecture diagrams this way, but you can also draw like kind of fancier. My team has used it for a bunch of different types of even like entity relationship diagrams if you have a database, or we've used draw.io for a bunch of different things, but they have like nice flowchart templates and stuff. And so anytime we have like a production workflow or something, we try to have a nice or reasonable diagram to go along with it. And I think that's what was used for the diagram that I showed as well. So why did the accuracy decrease with the loss as the model improved? So the challenge with this first sample, and I don't really love it, but we only have 4 samples. So if your weights are like really close to predicting one sample right, and then something changes just a little bit and it predicts wrong, you'll end up with cases where it gets worse or better, depending on how things are initialized. So I've seen examples where I'm training this model, and I have, and I don't know if my change broke things, but I'm just going to change that back to how it was originally. But I've had cases where the accuracy doesn't get better over time, or I'll say that like the loss barely changed, but we got one more sample correctly predicted. So you see the loss like went down a very, very small amount, but we predicted one additional sample right. So you're at like 50% now. So some of that is just a little bit of randomness and chance. You'll see the loss curves when we're working with this data set, which is bigger and a little bit more interesting. You'll see that as the loss improves, the accuracy improves as well. The loss is not bound to a value between 0 and 1. The sigmoid activation is, but the loss, it's bound from like 0 to infinity. So you can have a really, really high loss if your errors are really, really bad. And this is derived from this. So the loss that you were just seeing print out was the binary cross entropy log loss, and you can see it bottoms out at 0, and it can go very, very high as the errors get large.
Exploding weights are a thing.
Yeah, they are a thing, and that will happen actually. I think in well, we did it in ridge. When we did ridge regression, you saw cases where like the weights drastically increased, and then you added regularization and things got better. But yeah, the same can happen with neural networks.
Oh, Bruno, did you get a chance to see? I mean, to look at the question in Slack?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. So so when I added the layer via .add dense, is that a hidden or visible layer? So visible layer isn't necessarily like a terminology that I would use. So there's input layers, output layers, and then anything in between is a hidden layer. This architecture would look like this. Perceptron. So it would look something like this. So we have some inputs. We have a constant. The lines represent weights. We take the weighted sum, pass that into an activation function, and then get our output. So this is a perceptron. It just has inputs and an output. All of this is like what happens in between. So you have like input times weight, and then you kind of sum that up and pass it into an activation function, which in our case, we were using the sigmoid activation. So we have two inputs going to one output, and the weighted sum of those two inputs times the weights, as well as the bias get squishified in the sigmoid transformation or the activation function. Does that answer your question, Iskander?
Yes, thanks.
Cool. All right, so one of the nice things with TensorFlow Keras datasets is that they're already really nicely formatted. I'll say one of the more challenging things is if I just handed you a directory of like 100 images and said build me an image classification model, there's a little bit of like work to get it into the right format. It's not terribly difficult, but it is a little bit more involved than what we'll do here. In this case, you have xtrain, ytrain, xtest, ytest. It'll be a tuple, and we just do mnist.load data. And if I look at the shape of xtrain, this is the first image in xtrain. It's 28 by 28, so it's a matrix of 28 numbers by 28 numbers. If I look at the shape, we see we have 60,000 images, and each one is 28 by 28 pixels. And we can kind of preview what some of these might look like, right? So if we want to import matplotlib.pyplot as PLT, matplotlib has an imshow function where you can pass in an image. So I can take xtrain 0, for example, pass that in, and then these images are what's called like a single channel image. So it's grayscale, so it's just black and white images essentially versus a color image, which would have like a red, green, and blue channel, which would look kind of like this. It would be 60,000 by 28 by 28 by 3. That's what like a color version of this would look like, where each of those matrices would be like the red, green, and blue intensity that all kind of merge to create a color image. But if we look at this first image, we see that it looks like a 5. If we want to confirm that, we can look at ytrain 0 and see that it is a 5. And if you wanted to take another one, for example, we can look at the 20th image. This one looks like a 4, and we can confirm that by looking at ytrain 20. So this is the data that we'll be working with. If we go ahead and like preview what, let's say that 4 looks like to the computer, it's essentially a big matrix of values between 0 and 255. where 0 represents a black pixel, 255 represents a white pixel, and anything in between is kind of a gray, a version of gray essentially. If you were to like print this all out in like full matrix form, it would kind of look like a 4 just based on where the numbers are. But one thing that is important, it's not critical, but it's important, is what we're doing here. Does anybody know why this line is here? Or what the goal of this line is?
To normalize?
Yeah, Noor, so do you know why we would normalize? And it's okay if you don't know offhand.
No, I don't.
Only has computer only has 2 fingers, ones and zeros.
So not exactly. So kind of. There's a concept called gradient descent, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, but it's essentially how the model adjusts its weights. The analogy I like to give is, imagine you were at a winery and I blindfolded you and I said, find the lowest point in the hill. If I placed you in a winery and I said, find the lowest point in the winery, but you had a blindfold on. The way that you would do that likely is you would probably, feel on the ground maybe around you and try to figure out like where the steepest downhill portion is and then go that way, right? And you might end up kind of zigzagging throughout the winery until, maybe 20 minutes later, you feel like you're at the bottom of the winery or the lowest point in the winery. What happens is when you have like huge variation in the scale, you end up in a scenario like this. So there's an image for gradient descent. This is Chris Albon's like machine learning flashcards. There's a bunch of ways to get these for free, or you can pay like the $10 on his website to get the flashcards. But he has a bunch of really good notes on neural networks and other kind of machine learning topics. But what happens is if x1 and x2 are of a different scale, when you compute the derivative and try to figure out like which way is downhill, you can envision this as like that winery, imagine, was 10 football fields long and 1 football field wide. So the scale of x1 and x2 are very different. And it might take a much longer time to like scan and find the lowest point. Whereas when you scale them, when you adjust the scale so that it's the same distribution for x1 and x2, it makes it a lot easier for gradient descent to find a direct path to the minimum. And what minimum we're talking about is the loss function. So in our case, for the previous problem, we used this binary cross entropy, and we started with a few samples and our loss maybe was at a particular value, and we're trying to get to 0. But the way that our inputs are formatted or scaled would help increase that gradient step. So we'd be able to converge on a solution faster potentially if we scale. And in some cases, if you don't scale, it actually makes it really hard to settle on the minimum. So with much more complicated architectures, you can run into scenarios where your model thinks it's found the minimum, but it's maybe, in this case, this is 1 dimension, right? Like we just have 1 value and we're trying to minimize the loss based on that value. But you can think of when you have 100 features or thousands of features, you're actually like in a multi-dimensional surface plane and you're trying to find the minimum there. So scaling helps in some cases converge faster or converge at all to a solution that works. So if we scale these inputs and then look at x train 0 again, we'll see that it's all a 0 to 1 scale, where close to 1 would represent a high value and 0 would still represent 0. So that's one piece of this. The other thing that we would want to do when we pre-process this is, if you remember from the architecture, the inputs that we pass into our neural network, they're one long array, right? So in the previous example, we had like 2-dimensional arrays, but these images are matrices. So there's 2 different ways to handle this. One is to flatten it. So there's one of the layers in TensorFlow, Keras, is the flatten layer. And we can use that. And what that'll do is it'll take some input image that's in 2 dimensions and it'll flatten it to one long vector. And the way that that actually happens is if you look at this image, it takes this first row of 28 values, and that's the first 28 values in your vector. And then it goes and looks at the second row of 28 values, and it just appends that to the end of the first row. So it's the same set, it's the same numbers as the matrix. It's just one vector of 784 dimensions versus multiple rows or a matrix of 28 values by 28. So in the next step, we'll use the flatten layer, but the alternative, and in some cases, you'll have to do this depending on where you're getting your data, you can use the reshape functionality. So we can say xtrain equals xtrain dot reshape, and we want the shape of this to be 60,000 for the training set, so the number of images by 784. So we can say reshape, and the first dimension will be the number of samples, so shape 0, and then we can say 28 by 28. Or if you wanted to do like xtrain.shape1 and shape2, those are both 28 by 28. But this would reshape it as a 60,000 by 784 vector. And then you can do the same for X test.
And what is the point of flattening it? What's the benefit?
The point of flattening it is that when we input this to the first layer in our neural network, we need it as one vector, at least for a multi-layer perceptron network. So if we do that, and we see that we have 784. So it's the same way, like if you wanted to, let's say, train a model, let's say you wanted to train a random forest model to predict these images. You need to represent that in some flat input space, right? So, you know, like scikit-learn wouldn't accept a matrix as input for one row, right? So like take this matrix and predict a 1, a 0, a 5, a 9, or whatever value. But in this case, we now have 60,000 by 784. So that those 784 inputs will correspond to this input layer. And each of those will have weights that connect to hidden layers and to output layers. All right, so in terms of data kind of pre-processing, that's all that we really have to do. The data is kind of in a state now where it's ready for us to train a model. We'll again instantiate the sequential model. And I guess I'll just put that here, and I don't think we need that cell. So we'll instantiate our sequential model, and then our next step is to add whatever layers we want. So in this case, we'll add a couple of layers, right? So we'll have hidden layer number 1, and we can do model.add, put in our dense layer, units, we can do 32, activation. Generally recommended is the ReLU activation. I'll kind of show the image quickly with the 6 different popular activation functions. ReLU has some benefits, particularly with deep networks. And I'll point you to an article that goes through some of the trade-offs and advantages or disadvantages of different activation functions. But I'll generally say, like, starting with ReLU, trying sigmoid in some cases is probably enough experimentation on this particular parameter. And if you're running into certain issues that we'll talk about later in the sprint, there's variations of ReLU that work really well. And then our input dimensions are 784. And personally, so right now we're coding it up like this. Personally, there's different ways to configure your notebook or your script where it's a little bit easier to work with, right? So one thing you could do is you could have a cell up here, and I'll just comment it out for now, but you could have something like hidden neurons 1, right? So number of neurons in the first hidden layer, 32. Input dim equals xtrain dot shape 1, right? The benefit of specifying your inputs up here and then generalizing the actual network configuration to, use the variable instead of hard coding it is when you want to experiment with things, it's a lot easier to say, for input dim in some range, hidden neurons in some range, go and create the network, fit it, compile it, evaluate it, versus like changing it in 4 different places and then running all of those cells again. So generally, you can configure all of your inputs up here. And that'll kind of make you stay a little bit more organized. And you'll see in the third module of this sprint that this becomes helpful when you're trying to log experiments in a more systematic way. So we'll talk about what that means in next week. But for now, we'll just hard code these. So we'll have hidden layer 2, and then we'll have an output layer. So in our second hidden layer, we can have the same number of units if we want, and we don't need to specify the input dimension. You could if you wanted to, but the input to the second hidden layer would be the output of the first hidden layer. So it would be 32, not 784. So you could specify it, or if you leave it out, it's going to infer that based on the order that you ran that line essentially. So you instantiate your model here. As you add layers, the first layer, you need to specify the inputs. All subsequent layers, it'll infer that from the previous layer. And then our output layer, this is where it's important to specify, right? So does anybody know how many units we might want in our output layer for this example?
Uh, 784.
That's a good guess. So
Probably.
generally, with the hidden layers, you can put any number of units as a starting point at least. But the output layer, it's actually really important what you put for the number of units here.
Would it be 64?
Not 64.
Is
And
it
I'll tell
10?
you, yeah.
28?
So why 10?
Because we're guessing a number that is represented by an image between 0 and 9.
Yes, exactly. So I mentioned earlier that the input layer is always specified, or the input dimensions is always specified by the data, and so is the output layer. So what's funny, or what's not funny maybe, but if I make this 5, my model will only ever predict 5 numbers. And what you'll see is I'll get an error that says something to the effect of, I won't get an error here, right? So I can run this and I won't get an error. But when I try to actually fit the model, it's going to say, hey, there's a mismatch because there's 10 unique values in your Y train and only 5 values in your output layer. So, and it probably won't be as clear as how I just said it. It'll probably be a little bit like murky, and you'll have to Google and Stack Overflow to figure out why. But this is one of the most critical decisions you have to make in terms of architecture. So what is the output layer for this problem? And does anyone know the activation function? So I haven't introduced it yet, but if you're familiar with this example or this data set, this flashcard talks about common output layer activation functions. So for binary classification, you want to output 0 or 1, and sigmoid is exactly what 0 or 1 represents. When you're doing multi-class classification, so in this case, we have 10 different numbers we're trying to predict, you use something called a softmax. And what softmax does is it essentially takes in some vector of numbers. They could be any number in the world. So in this case, it'll be, so our architecture is going to have some inputs from our second hidden layer. So our output layer is going to have, there's our inputs, one hidden layer and another hidden layer, and it's going to have some output. And those outputs can be anything. They can be any number from 0 to 1,000,000 or higher. They can even be negative in some cases. But what the output function is trying to do is transform that to a probability. So for binary classification, you want that probability to be between 0 and 1. And for a multi-class classification problem, what we're going to have is we're going to have 10 neurons. And what softmax does is it takes in some vector as input, and then it transforms that vector into a series of numbers between 0 and 1 that, importantly, they sum up to 1. So I don't remember if it's in a notebook. I know a previous iteration of this, we kind of go through the softmax formula and like what it actually does. I can show that in the next class. I don't have it handy right now, but essentially you can pass in a vector of 10 numbers. And what it'll do is it'll look at the proportion of those numbers in relation to each other, and it'll transform them to some other number between 0 and 1. And when you sum up those 10 numbers, you get 100%. So that'll be important because our model will be able to interpret, let's say, a 95 or 0.95 as 95% likely that that is the correct prediction. So it might be a 7 or a 4 or 3, whichever neuron has the highest probability is what your model will predict. And that could be like if your model is totally confused, it's a really bad image, that number could be 0.3 or 0.2. Right? If that's the highest of the 10, that's what your model will predict. But this will, and one important thing, so I already ran this cell, so this is just something to keep in mind. So if I look at a summary of my network right now, I have my input layer, which is 784 by 32. So that's how many weights I have in my first layer. And then plus 784 gets you 784 biases, gets you like this. And then in the next layer, I have 32 units times 32 units. That's how you get this plus the bias. And then in my output, I have 5. So remember, I ran this cell already. If I run it again, all I'm doing is appending to the sequential model. So the sequential model, each time you instantiate this model object, initially it's empty, and then as you add layers, it'll continue to add layers until you compile and fit. So, so when I had a 5 here and was playing around with it, that I didn't want that, right? So if I rerun this cell, it's going to create a new kind of empty sequential model. And when I run this, it'll have just those 3 layers with the right dimensions that I want.
Bruno?
Yes.
So quick question. For the hidden layer 1 and 2, for the number of units, you specified 32, and they were just arbitrary? You just decided on the number of 32, or is there a reasoning behind?
Yeah, so that was arbitrary, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next class about how to select those numbers, and we'll talk about it even further in the 3rd class on like how to tune and kind of, there's some intuition around like generally a deeper network is better than a wider network. So like I can make this, 10 million or something, and that might not help me as much as adding another layer with a somewhat with much fewer hidden units. So we'll dive into some of that intuition a little bit more. The real goals today, if I kind of scroll up to the objectives, 3 objectives today: understand foundational components of neural networks, be able to work with the Keras sequential model API, and we'll talk a little bit about selecting a model architecture. And we'll run some experiments in this last portion after our next break, where we'll kind of experiment with different number of units, different activation functions, different optimizers, different number of layers, etc.
Oh, another question. Where you have input dimensions, I understand that the first hidden layer is defined by the input data, which is 784 elements for the array, and then you decided on the number of units arbitrarily. But how about the second? And well, I mean, why would you? The 32, are those the weights that you multiply the 784 elements by?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and
Thank you.
yeah, for any subsequent hidden layer, it's inferred. So this layer knows that there's 32 because it comes after this one. But if they were different, which you could have 64 in the first, 32 in the second, the input dimension to this layer is 64, and it would infer that based on the sequence. But I'm just going to leave it at 32 for now. So anyway, so this is the summary of our model. You can see this is way more weights or parameters than any kind of model you used in Unit 2. We're learning 26,506 different weights and bias values to multiply, our input image vector by to get to a prediction of 0 to 9. And when we compile our model, we'll do model.compile. And again, we have our loss. So in this case, there's two different loss functions that you could use, and it depends on the data. So in our case, if we look at, let's say, if we look at ytrain and we look at the first 10 values, for example, you see that it's 504. It's just the actual number. And the loss function that deals with that data format is sparse categorical cross entropy. This works really similarly to the binary cross entropy that we used in the example, in the previous example. But the difference between like the sparse categorical cross entropy, and then you see here, there's another one called categorical cross entropy. There's different ways to encode your input, and sometimes it's going to be like this. Other times you might have a one-hot encoded vector, right? So you can envision for this like the one-hot encoded version might look something like, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, if that's 10, but this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. So 4, or I guess we can do 5. So if your ytrain is in this format, so one-hot encoded format, then you would use the categorical cross entropy. And some people just do that transformation anyway. I don't think there's a huge upside to doing it. But in our case, ytrain is like this. So what we want to do is use the sparse categorical cross entropy. And then for our optimizer, we'll use Atom, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into optimizers as well next class. And then for metrics, we'll output accuracy. And then I think you can specify multiple metrics. So like I've trained models in some cases where there's like 50 categories and I care about the top 5 accuracy versus just the top accuracy. So you can have like a top K accuracy or something if you want to print out both of these as you train the model. So that's it. So once you compile, you can do model.fit, pass in xtrain, ytrain, and then you have to specify how long do you want to train. So how many epochs? We'll just do 10. And then you can also, if you want to monitor the validation performance, you can pass in this optional attribute of validation data. And we have x test, y test. So if you pass it in as a tuple, when you run this, what you're seeing is it's taking a little bit longer. It's taking like 3 or 4 seconds to train. But what you're seeing is if you look at these epochs as they train, so they're incrementing in batches of 32. And next sprint or next module, we'll talk about this batch size parameter. But essentially, you're showing your model 32 images at a time, looking at the loss for those 32 images, and then updating the weights each time. So for one epoch, you might be updating the weights, in this case, 1,875 times. And so you're taking like small steps in the right direction, And you can see that after 10 epochs, we're at about 96% accuracy on our validation data, 97, 98% accuracy on our training data. And it's not a super complicated model, right? So we have 2 hidden layers, an output layer, and we're able to train pretty well. But what I want to do real quick is if I change this activation to ReLU, for example, I won't get an error. And this is one of the hard parts of neural networks. So I can run this again and I won't get an error. I'll just get really bad performance, right? Like roughly random performance. And these are the types of things that like are tricky with neural networks. In this case, this is like a common example that we work with all the time. And it's telling that, you know, my validation accuracy is about random. If you guessed randomly, you'd be about 10% accurate with this data set. But nothing's wrong, right? I didn't get an error or anything like that. So specifying the architecture is one of the most important things that you can do as a data scientist when you're working with neural networks. And knowing some of these things, like what activation you should use depending on that problem type, you know, so, you know, a refresher that these are the 3. If you had a regression problem, you don't have to specify any activation function. So you would just not have an activation function in your last layer. And these are all output layers. If you're doing binary classification, sigmoid, multi-class, softmax. And that becomes important for, you know, like that's like a make or break decision in terms of the quality of your models. So I'll just run this again so we're left with a good example. And then I'll just go through this next step of evaluating the model on a few samples. And then we'll take a break. And when we come back, we'll jump into this last portion of our class today, which will dive a little bit more into the intuition of choosing an architecture. So if we want to evaluate the model, we already have the validation accuracy kind of printing out. So that's not, so generally you can kind of just run the fit command and look at the validation accuracy. But if you wanted to evaluate it separately, you could still do X test, Y test here. Model. The other thing that you can do is if we wanted to look at an image, for example, so let's test an image from our validation set. So if we look at the 200th image, and then reminder, these are 784 dimension vectors, but the imshow function is expecting a like n by n image, like it's expecting a matrix. So we can reshape it back to 28 by 28 and then do a CMAP gray. So this image is a 3 and it looks like it's a pretty clear 3. So if you wanted to predict on just this one image, for example, you could do model.predict and then as a NumPy array, we can pass in xtest 200. And what you see here is these are the probabilities for each class, right? So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. You can see in this case, it's like 99.99% sure that it's a 3. And for every other value, it's nearly 0. So it's very confident this is a 3. You could also extract that by using the NP argmax. So this will return to you the index value for the maximum value in the prediction. And if you want to play around with these a few times, you can try different images. There were some in here that we got wrong. I don't remember the number, the index number, but yeah, no, that one's pretty confident. Also a 3. But there are some in here where you'll see a misclassification. But yeah, so if you want to play around a little bit, and then one other note is if you look at your model training, your validation accuracy might be slightly different than mine, right? So there is some randomness to a neural network based on how the weights get initialized, right? So each of our models, if we didn't set the seed the same, we might have some initial conditions that look different. And then we might converge on a slightly different set of weights that still results in good performance, but maybe not identical performance, right? So for most architectures, I'm assuming we all have roughly 96%, plus or minus, let's say 1 or 2%. But there is some randomness to this. So, you know, the way that you experiment with these models is important in many cases to ensure that you're accounting for things like random seeds consistently, so that you don't kind of make decisions based on you know, this architecture being better than that one just by chance, for example. All right, so we're a little bit over our next break, so let's take another 5-minute break. And when we come back, we'll jump into this last section, which we'll dive into a few different architectures. All right, welcome back, everybody. So I did see a couple of questions in Slack. I don't know if they've been answered already, but so Timothy, you asked the 32 units in the hidden layer. That was an arbitrary choice. We'll talk a little bit in this next section around how to specify the number of units and the number of layers. Your second question was, can you name the layers so that when you look at the summary, it doesn't come up as like dense 15, but you can actually name it something? You absolutely can. So, you know, if you wanted to name it, so this hidden layer, if I wanted to name this first one as something other than dense 15, you could say input dense 32, let's say, since it's 32 units. You can add that name attribute, and when you look at the summary, it'll name it like whatever you wanted to name it here. So you can name your layers, and in some cases, it's easier to read, especially if you're like taking a screenshot of this and like putting it into a presentation or something. You might want to name them kind of accordingly, but by default, it'll increment the dense. It'll put the type of layer in lowercase and then underscore by like whatever layer it is in your notebook. So if you've been like running a million networks, you might have like dense 375. But the first, like if you start a notebook from scratch, it would be dense 1, dense 2, dense 3, etc., depending on the layer types. So you can add an optional name if you want to. Let's see, anything in Slido? So this one, I think, yeah, this one came in as well. So what are the most common TensorFlow problems we'll see in the wild? Probably the most common problems where you would go to TensorFlow first before scikit-learn, or maybe other ML libraries, are computer vision for sure. I think there's very few problems that you would not use a neural network for in computer vision. NLP, a lot of NLP problems now depend in some way on a neural network. Not all of them, but there's definitely a handful that you'll kind of consistently get better performance from a neural network architecture. And there's definitely a few others. If you go to TensorFlow tutorials is really good. If you just search like TensorFlow tutorials and then go to their tutorials page, on the left-hand side here under advanced, they have a bunch of different ones. So images, they have like 7 different images examples. Text is another one that's really common. Reinforcement learning, another one that's very common. Audio is maybe a little bit common, but structured data is like how you would do like regular, you know, forecasting or classification with tabular data. I think it's pretty rare that you'll get better performance from, let's say, a classification problem with a neural network than you would with like gradient boosted trees or random forest or some other version of an ensemble model. So yeah, I think the 2 big use cases are images and text. Those are also pretty common types of data to interact with in the wild. And there's certainly some other edge cases where you might get some benefit from using a neural network architecture or TensorFlow, but yeah, I would say looking at the tutorials might give you a good sense of what the most common use cases will be. And in the next sprint, we'll also kind of look at some of the major use cases and architectures to consider in those cases. All right, so this last section is choosing an architecture, and we'll do 2 things. So for one, we'll kind of introduce something called TensorBoard, which is it's just a way to visualize some nice plots that are useful in comparing models to each other. So TensorBoard is really nice, and you get it for free if you just set up the logs and something called a callback. And you can see this is kind of what it looks like with a bunch of different models. We'll kind of create a new one, which will be a little bit cleaner. But to create this callback, you just run this. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a log directory when we run it. And that log directory is going to have a date timestamp of whatever the time now is. And it's going to log things like the loss, the accuracy, and you can log additional metrics like the parameters you were using for your network, et cetera. You can log all of those to your TensorBoard graph, and it ends up being a pretty nice way to stay organized and a nice way to go back to results of previous model trainings, right? So if you trained 100 different models or architectures, you could go back to the 30th one and compare that to the most recent one based on the data that's written to that log directory. So we're gonna do two things. So one, we're gonna reload the training data. The reason I'm doing this is because I've already reshaped the data to be a 784 length vector. I'm gonna introduce this other layer called the flatten layer that you can use to reshape the data in your network architecture versus doing it ahead of time. So we're just going to reload the data so that it's in the 3 dimensions that we were given initially. So if you do x test, y test, and then equals mnist dot load data, and then we can print xtrain dot shape just to confirm. So we see this is in 3 dimensions right now, and I'm going to put all the code in this one cell, so it'll save a little bit of space, but we're missing one layer. So the layer that I was mentioning was tensorflow.keras.layers import flatten. And then this flatten layer is going to be the first layer that essentially reshapes our data. And then everything after that would be the input layer, hidden layer, and then output layer. So if I do model equals sequential, the other thing you can do, so you can do model equals sequential and then do model dot add whatever layer you want, and then do it sequentially like we did before. Or some people prefer to keep it clean and have it all in the same constructor. So what you can do is if you put a list in here, I don't know why it's not letting me go here, but sorry. But you can specify your layers here, right? So this first layer will be the flatten layer. And remember, we're only using a flatten layer because we want to go from 2-dimensional matrix images to a single input layer vector, essentially. So if we say flatten and we tell this layer that our input shape is 28 by 28, what this will do is it'll say, hey, it's 28 by 28, let me flatten that to a 784 dimension vector for all the images that you process in your model or in your network. So our next model or our next layer would be our dense layer, and we can specify a different number if we want to, right? So we can do 64 units and then an activation of ReLU. Another dense layer, we can reduce it. Generally, I've seen it's more often or it's more common to reduce the number of neurons as you go deeper into the network. And what you can think about, and it'll be more clear when we look at images in the next sprint when we look at CNNs or convolutional neural networks, but the depth of your network, you can think of the deeper your network, the more specific types of features it's learning about the input vector, right? So you can think of, you have an image, the first layer is going to try to extract features like, edges and lines and things, and then deeper layers might start to recognize that, hey, when you combine these 2 lines at a certain angle, it looks like that might be a really important feature to predict a 7 or a 4. So as you go deeper into your network, it's you can think of the types of features that you're now combining, like you're doing this combination multiplication of all of your inputs, and the deeper you get into the network, the more interacting effects between, you know, pixel 200 and 350, or any other combination of pixels. You're giving your model that opportunity to essentially like try all of the interactions. You know, and if you remember with linear regression, let's say you had 5 features, x1 through x5, and you're trying to predict y. A linear regression can only identify linear relationships between x1 and the target, x2 and the target, x1 plus x2 and the target. But it doesn't know what to do with x1 times x2, right? Like you'd have to create that feature on your own to give your model a chance to leverage that relationship. With neural networks, there's generally less pre-processing involved and less feature engineering involved, because you can think of at an abstract level, when you have these multiple hidden layers, because of the nature of these like densely connected layers, like x0 and x75 are connected in some of these hidden layers. And as you have more hidden layers, there's like varying depths of that connection that enable you to identify like patterns in your inputs that in a linear model or a traditional kind of scikit-learn model, you would have to engineer like tons of possible features to get to a place where, you know, the interaction between these 5 pixels and these 10 pixels combined to predict a 7 versus a 9 or a 4 or something like that. So I know that's a little bit abstract, but generally, you know, the deeper the network, the more complex the features it can extract from your inputs are. And the width of the network, so like the number of hidden neurons, that's generally a little bit less important to try like huge values for. So like I've seen different guidelines. I've seen different guidelines for, you know, you shouldn't have, like in our case, we have 784 is the dimension of our input. And in this first layer, you should try to not select a number of units that's higher, like more units than the number of inputs. So something like half of the number of inputs might be a good starting point. In our case, we're starting a little bit lower, and then kind of reducing as you go deeper into the network is generally what you'll see people do with multi-layered dense perceptron networks. So we'll compile this similar to how we did before. So our loss function will be sparse, categorical, cross entropy. Our optimizer will be atom, and our metrics accuracy. The one caveat that I'll say, so if I print the model.summary here, the one caveat that I'll say with so the one caveat that I'll say with neural networks is there isn't a tried and true, this is the best way to initialize your network or to generate your network. The general guidance is start simple, right? So start with a 1 or 2 hidden layer network, and then experiment in a critical way. So don't just like grid search and try everything. Try training the model and then try adding a hidden layer. So try going a little bit deeper. And what you'll do is you'll start with 1 hidden layer, maybe go to a 2nd hidden layer and observe whether or not that improved things. If it didn't, then go back to 1 hidden layer and try adding more neurons. Did adding more neurons help? Okay, then keep it at that. Now add another hidden layer. Did that help? Okay, keep that layer, and then kind of incrementally improve your network until you reach whatever your desired accuracy is. And yes, I'll say that's one approach, and that's kind of a systematic approach to building a deeper, more complex network without just starting with a 10 hidden layer network or a 100 hidden layer network, which in some cases just won't train, and it'll take a lot longer to train. The other recommendation that I'll make for designing an architecture, so one is that kind of iterative development approach I just mentioned, where you change one thing at a time, be it the activation function, the number of units, or the depth, and then incrementally make improvements from there. The other thing that I would recommend, and is very commonly used, is papers with code. If you haven't seen this before, it's a site where it'll show you trending research, and more specifically, they'll kind of link back to code for that paper. So they might have a full-on paper that they published, but they also have the GitHub where you can look at the architecture and the layers that were used, etc. So this is where I go. I'm on the site once a week at least, and I'll kind of just read some new abstract, or sometimes dive deeper if it's relevant to a project I'm working on. But the research side of it is, if you go to browse state of the art, they have it broken out by like type of problem, essentially. So computer vision, if you're doing image classification, or object detection, or image generation, or natural language processing, if you're building a model that's generating text or answering questions. And you can see there's a ton of tasks, right? So for computer vision, there's like all of these different tasks, and within each group, there's like different subtasks. And what you would do is, imagine I'm asking you to build a image classification model. So you go here and you look at some of these benchmark data sets, and you try to think about which data set might be the most similar to the data I'm working with, right? So MNIST is very rarely going to be similar to the data set you're working with at a company. But there's other data sets that, are more broadly generalizable, right? So if you're working in the medical domain, there's a lot of medical imaging data sets. If you're working in, satellite imagery, there's a bunch of kind of benchmark satellite image data sets. So what you would do is you would, let's say, go to MNIST, right? In our case, we're working with MNIST. If we wanted to figure out what's the best model I can develop, or the best architecture I can use to solve MNIST, you can look at percentage error, and you can look at these different papers, and you can see this first one is a convolutional neural network with like filter capsules. So it's pretty researchy, but it predicts almost perfectly on MNIST. You can also see it's 1.5 million parameters. But this is how, in practice, you would kind of try to leverage the work that other people have done to hyperparameter tune and find optimal architectures, and apply that immediately to something that you're working on, right? And you can go down this list. You can click on this one, for example, and it looks like this one doesn't have a code implementation, but the paper is in here, and in the paper, they probably go into the architecture a little bit. But if you were to click, VGG5, this is like a pretty common architecture, and it looks like the GitHub repo is SpinalNet. And if you go in here, it has some information about the architecture and probably some code and how to run this. So this would be that would be like an option 2. If you're, if your use case requires state-of-the-art accuracy, see what state-of-the-art results have been achieved on data sets like the one that you're working on. But at a simple level, I'll say I always err on the side of simple and effective. So before I go and train the fanciest, newest architecture, I try things that are simpler and maybe more quickly, and maybe I can get a sense of the feasibility of it more quickly. So anyway, this is our architecture, and then if we want to fit our model here, we would do model.fit, pass in xtrain and ytrain. We can do, let's say, 20 epochs. We can change the batch size. Well, the next class we'll talk in detail about batch size, but if we wanted to make it like 128, this would be 128 batches of 128 images shown to our network at a time before it updates weights. The default is 32. That's what the default value is. So we're choosing a batch size that's higher in this case. And then we want to see our validation accuracy. So if we do validation data, and then we'll pass in X test and Y test. And then the last thing you need if you want to log to TensorFlow is callbacks. So callbacks, what it's going to do is it's essentially going to log to this TensorBoard callback at the end of every epoch. So we have a log file in the background that we created, and each time an epoch completes, it's going to log the metrics at that time. And that's what callbacks do. They essentially do something at the end of each epoch. And we'll learn about a few different callbacks as we progress through this sprint, but there's some other ones that can stop the model training at a certain time when the validation accuracy stops improving, for example. And there's different kind of cases like that where it might be beneficial. But once this is done, if you want to view the TensorBoard log, you just run this code cell. It'll take a second. But you'll be left with a few different plots. So this is your accuracy as a function of the number of epochs that you ran. You can see this is a pretty well-behaved curve in terms of, it's getting better over time and it's not iterating a ton or dropping in accuracy. So this would be like a decent model. I would say there's different ways to read this curve, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail next class. But there's cases where the training accuracy improves or keeps improving, but the validation accuracy stalls, right? And these are some of the telltale signs that would give you a sense of whether or not you're overfitting. The same with the epoch loss. And then there's some more detailed things that you can look at in TensorBoard. With the graphs, this will show you kind of the architecture of all the network, of all the models that you've fit so far. This is the last one we just did here, this flatten, dense output. You can also see distributions of the bias values. And these I don't typically use too much, but the histograms can be informative. The way to read this is if you look at, this is epoch over epoch. So as you continue to train the model, this is showing like the delta change in the weights for this dense layer, this bias value. And you'll rarely, I think, look at this in detail unless you're trying to troubleshoot a specific problem. But generally, you should see some amount of movement throughout training, and it should follow some pattern that looks kind of like this. You'll see if I gave you a data set that was a real world data set with lots of noise and it was much harder to predict, and you were trying to troubleshoot or debug an architecture, you would look at these plots to understand like whether or not, for example, like as you train, if you start seeing the changes in the values like almost zero, that would give you a sense that maybe using a different activation function might help. Because if your network's really deep, you could run into something called the vanishing gradient problem. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this throughout the sprint, but these are some of the kind of high-level tools that TensorBoard offers. There's a lot more to it in terms of tracking experiments that we'll kind of talk about in the third module of this sprint, but TensorBoard is a really useful tool. And I'm doing a time check. I don't think we'll have time to go through all of these, so this could be something that you kind of work through. But for an experiment, this is kind of a crowdsource a little bit, so we might run a few minutes over if we want to just quickly review some of these. But if your birthday is January to March, try adding an additional layer to the model that we defined up here, right? So essentially, you would want to copy the callback. So this will create a new log file. And you can also name the log file. So in this case, we were just naming the log file. And if I look in Colab directory, you'll see there's logs, and then there's the timestamp, which was generated with this code. But you can also name it. And I prefer naming it when it's a specific experiment, right? So you can name it like additional hidden layer. And now when the folder gets created, it'll say additional hidden layer. And you can name your experiments in that way so that you can go back to like what you tried at that time. And this will create the callback. And then if you want to modify the network, you would take all of this. And in this case, we wanted to add one more hidden layer. So let's say we add that, and we'll just be symmetric about this and do 16. But this would be one additional hidden layer. And then I'm just going to add the model.fit command as well, or copy that. So that would be one additional hidden layer. And then you can fit it and look at the logs again, and you'll be able to compare this additional hidden layer run to your initial run, and then any other experiments. So for this section, if your birthday falls between January and March, maybe add another hidden layer and go to 4 hidden layers. If you're between April and June, try adding 2 hidden layers with the same number of neurons. So in this case, I like halved them as I added more layers, but make them all the same essentially. July to September, try changing the activation function in the hidden layer. So we were using ReLU, but you can try to use sigmoid, for example, or some of the other ones available based on this chart. These are some of the more popular ones. So sigmoid takes on this like 0 to 1 transformation. And we kind of saw like the benefit of this function is that it allows you to learn nonlinear mappings between your inputs and outputs. And this can shift based on the weights as well as the bias, left to right. ReLU is kind of nice. It's a simple function. So it's essentially if the, right, so if we think back to like what are we transforming? I don't think I have that open anymore, but if we take this architecture, in this neuron, we have x0 times weight 0 plus x1 times weight 1 plus bias 1 times weight 0. All of these get multiplied and summed, and then the combination of those gets passed into the activation function, whether it's sigmoid or ReLU or something else. And if the weighted sum is negative, what ReLU will do is it will map that negative value to 0, and anything that's positive, it returns the exact same value. So ReLU has some nice properties with deep networks. It generally trains faster, and it's generally recommended as your starting point. Like most papers will recommend that ReLU achieves good performance out of the box. Sigmoid has some issues as your network gets deep. Tanch is not super useful for some architectures and more useful for others. So like when we learn about LSTMs, you'll see the benefit of TANH, but it's essentially the same or similar curve to sigmoid, but instead of 0 to 1, it has a bound of -1 to 1. And then there's these on the right. These are all intended to solve like some shortcoming of ReLU or sigmoid. But leaky ReLU, instead of zeroing out negative values, it will return some small non-zero value. And this becomes important when you're dealing with dying neurons, essentially. And we'll talk about all of this in a little bit more detail. I know I'm throwing a ton of information out in our very first class here. We'll have more time, I think, to dive into these, edge cases in a little bit more detail. But You can essentially think of a dying neuron as like if your ReLU is always zeroing out negative values, once you get into a phase where a lot of values in the same neuron are 0, the weight applied to inputs to that neuron end up being 0 or really close to 0. So if you return a small non-zero value, as you train the model and do backpropagation, you end up with weights that don't die quite as easily, at least. All right, so I've said a bunch. And then the last one is try changing the optimization function. There's a bunch of different ones. I'll show this paper again, but there's a really great paper that I'll share. And some of the plots that I've shared today, I'll share in our class channel as well. But there's different optimization algorithms. There's like maybe some of the most popular ones are Atom, RMS prop, and then Adagrad is another really popular one. This is one of the better papers I've seen out of, it's a researcher. He wrote it when he was doing his PhD, but he's a research engineer at Google, does a lot of work in NLP. But he essentially compared a bunch of different variants of gradient descent, as well as a bunch of different optimization algorithms. And you don't have to read this whole paper, although if you're really interested in some of the mathematics behind these techniques, I'd say this is a great kind of approachable paper. There's definitely some math in it, but it's not like crazy overwhelming. But there's a section in here, 4.10, where he talks about which optimizer should you use. And this last sentence is maybe the takeaway, that Atom might be the best overall choice in most cases, followed closely by RMS prop, and then yeah, adding like momentum to stochastic gradient descent is another kind of promising option. So we'll review this in more detail. We'll talk a little bit more about optimizers and some of those edge cases that I kind of cautioned to you, but these are some of the experiments you can try. I'd say the two main takeaways on this last section of choosing an architecture that I would recommend is, one, iteratively make changes. Don't change 5 different things and then try to understand whether the performance increasing or decreasing was because of one of those 5 things. Or, if I change all of these activations to softmax, I can quickly look and see, okay, I was at 96.51% validation accuracy. When I change it to softmax, or when I change it to sigmoid for all of these intermediate layers, that improved things or didn't, right? It's much easier to make those decisions when you change one thing at a time versus multiple things at a time. The other important thing is, when you're given a new problem in the wild, you're at a company or something, Papers with Code is a really good reference for finding like working code examples of architectures that have proven to be really effective for similar problems. So that's the other way I would say of choosing architectures when you don't have maybe as much time to do all of the experimentation that you'd like. But yeah, so that, in terms of 3 objectives today, I think we covered a lot of ground. In terms of your assignment for today, we'll just peek at that real quick. So for your assignment, this has changed since the last time I did it, but you'll build a classification model and then you'll run a few different experiments. So you'll build some baseline model, which will be kind of a simple model, and then you'll be asked to change the optimizers as well as the parameters within the optimizers. So this is something we didn't cover specifically, but there's some kind of notes and stretch goals in here that will guide you in the right direction. And if you have questions on any of this, feel free to ask them. But in terms of this section right here on changing optimizers, when we like use the Atom optimizer in our model, just specifying Atom uses the default parameters. So we've talked about all of these hyperparameters that you can change in the architecture based on the number of units or the activation functions. But the optimizer itself has some default values. And in the assignment, you'll be asked to, instead of passing in Atom as single quotes, you'll be asked to essentially like take this line where you import the Atom optimizer, right? And instead of passing an Atom like that, you can pass in Atom like this as a variable essentially. And then there's certain inputs to the Atom optimizer that you can change, like the learning rate and some other ones that you can play around with. And then you can kind of observe what happened. But that will be your assignment. Yes, yeah, and Iskander, so I'll save this now. If you access the link that I shared earlier today, it should have this final version of the notebook. And if you have questions on your assignment, definitely ask them in Slack, and I'll be available to help answer questions tomorrow, as well as the TLs and Brandon. Once the video is done processing, I'll send it to Brandon, and he'll try to get it posted either tonight or early tomorrow morning. But yeah, that's all I have, and I didn't see any questions, but there's maybe I'll answer this question in Slack. I know we're already over time, so I'll let you guys drop, and I'll just write up a quick answer to this question in Slack, and then I'll also share some of the images that I've talked about, and the notebook is updated, so you'll be able to access the most recent version of the notebook from the link I shared earlier. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you guys again tomorrow or Thursday.